DreamWorks takes a massive W because Dogman was awesome. I feel like we've been in this lull of not having too many movies that are okay with not taking themselves too seriously, and Dogman hit it out of the park with its characters, unique identity away from Captain Underpants, and the themes that it explores. I was interested to see how Dogman would translate into a feature-length movie given that much of its dialogue would be quite limited, and in watching the trailers, they were already burning through many of the surface level jokes you can make with a dog.
So if somebody breaks out your favorite chew toy and waves it around, you look at the monitors.
So their solution was to make each supporting character work their butts off to carry Dogman's limited vocal range. Because while almost every character would have a different dynamic with Dogman, it only maximized what you can do with him. You had Petey, who served as the major villain of the movie, who naturally doesn't like Dogman because they're on opposite ends of the good and evil spectrum. So that brought the intensity in Dogman. However, you'd also have Chief, who served as Dogman's right-hand man, and ironically his man best friend if you think about it, who provided more of the slower, more grounded moments between the pair. While that was nice and good, there was a big question I had for this spin-off movie, and it answered it pretty quickly. One of the biggest questions I had was how was it going to separate itself from the Captain Underpants movie without venturing too far from what a Dave Pilkey book tends to offer. Ideally, while I enjoy Captain Underpants, the first epic movie, given my stance on stuff like Camp Coral and the Patrick Star Show, I would be a little hypocritical to be okay with a spin-off providing essentially the same value but in a different coat of paint. Surprisingly, I can make a great argument that Dogman was a different vibe in the same umbrella of goofy comedy. For one, the toilet humor wasn't as prominent in this movie, as many jokes such as the stories Dogman would read, playing catch, and the squeaky toy joke within the trailers dominated a large part of the comedic range he provided. But more importantly, Dogman, as crazy as this sounds, was a lot more emotionally impactful, specifically because of one character who was like the star of the movie. Lil Petey humanized Petey quite a bit, and yes, humanizing a cat sounds very weird to say, but blame our human self-centric way of naming things. When you first watch the movie, Petey is depicted to be a typical evildoer for evildoer's sake type villain, which was arguably Professor Poopy Pants within the Captain Underpants movie, as that movie didn't really lean on giving Professor P a lot of range outside of one empathy flashback. But I'd argue he works there because that movie wasn't trying to evoke the same emotions that Dogman did, which is why I feel this movie made its unique mark, and why I may like this movie a little bit better, although it's a little too early. Petey would initially create Little Petey for the purposes of having someone just like him to take over the world, particularly when Little Petey creates a positive rapport with Dogman, knowing that he's connected to Dogman's mortal enemy. It made me think about how they were gonna wrap up that in a satisfying bow, which they did in a very wholesome way. However, before we get to Dogman's interesting self-dynamic, we gotta talk about the core of what made this movie work. For me, I enjoyed the family themes that were explored within the movie with Petey, as Lil Petey chiseled away at his cold exterior to make the viewer want to see them finally embrace. I will say towards the end of the movie, there were several back-to-back scenes that really tug on your heartstrings. One of the scenes involved Petey ordering an undo button earlier in the movie to get rid of Lil Petey, and by the end of the movie being presented with the option. You also had Petey hearing about how he sounded to Lil Petey as he echoed his sentiments about the world and seeing the impact it could have had on his child or clone, or both. This hits different when you realize what Petey did to Lil Petey earlier in the movie and how he forgave him for that and understood that Petey's father wasn't exactly the best influence on him. However, and maybe this is just because of the Bad Guys mini-movie that played before the movie, Petey is kind of double dipping in the same range that the Bad Guys offers and making what are characters that do morally wrong acts still feel likable because of their tendency to make things right. I enjoy antagonistic characters, but I often feel like in our modern media, zooming away from Dogman, away from the bad guys, they're afraid often to really push things too far and fear that the viewer may not like the whole thing just because they don't like this one character who is designed in many cases to not be liked. But as a person who grew up on Billy and Mandy, Ed, Ed and Eddie, Pinky and the Brain, The Fairly Odd Parents, among I'm sure several more, you can make characters that make morally wrong decisions still be entertaining without introducing the empathy card by just making them lose. That is one aspect I like about the Captain Underpants movie. Professor P doesn't lean on being likable to work. However, there's one tiny aspect about this movie that isn't explored as much as I thought, but gave me several questions and made me wonder to see if there's any other animated show or movie that answers this kind of question. So there's one aspect about Dogman that I wish I locked in on, and ironically, it's the same thing that I thought when I watched Steven Universe. I know it sounds crazy, but hear me out. In the first season of Steven Universe, there's the episode Alone Together where you get to see the fusion between Steven and Connie for the first time. As to Vonnie, they experience a lot of new emotions together, and the one that I want to focus on is this blend between confusion and loneliness.
Sweet. 2 donuts. One for me and one for me. Are you okay? We can stop if you... No, don't worry.
So I bring this up because in that episode, they didn't really focus specifically on this aspect of their fusion and how much their consciousness is together, and if it was a significant amount, should they conceptualize their thoughts as separate as one? It was a lot of questions I had. It was an interesting mental parallel that Dogman also teased, although here, it wasn't as explored as much. I thought about it when Dogman was revisiting his old home and realizing how much they miss said significant other that they shared together. It made them feel lonely, but I wonder how lonely they were and how much lonelier it would feel if 2/3 of this family dynamic was fused together. Like, would you feel like you had the other third and felt less lonely? Or because you're now one and thus it becomes more of a one-on-one dynamic, would you feel more lonely because you lost the entire thing? Now, obviously, I'm not saying that I wanted Dogman to give me what Savani does, but it is something that fascinates me about fusion in general that I'd like to see explored at some point within Western animation. But beyond that, DreamWorks has had a great run this decade for me because of all the movies I've watched from them, with the exception of Ruby Gillman, which was a big miss. They've made some of my favorite movies in recent times, from The Bad Guys, Puss in Boots: The Last Wish, The Wild Robot, and now Dogman. In fact, based on the lineup of animated movies at least announced to come out this year, I think Dogman might be top 3 for me once we get around to December, at least in terms of animated movies that came out this year. However, I want to turn the clock back to the last decade. As funny as Dogman is, I feel like we wouldn't have gotten it if not for Captain Underpants being the perfect blueprint for creating an animated adaptation, which you can check out here.